Welcome to the Cashflow Academy Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. So excited for this episode. I have my good friend, a longtime friend, Richard Duncan is with us. I'll introduce him momentarily. He is the person I go to first and foremost for anything macroeconomic. He had a chance to consult with the IMF, and he has a resume 1,000 miles long that we'll get into. But he has a talent and certainly a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the big picture. And my mentor, Robert Kiyosaki, one of the reprimands he would often give me is getting small and not keep the big picture in mind. So this is fantastic. Like and subscribe. Tell your friends. And also, we've got some really cool places for you to go. We're going to tell you about Macro Watch, which is a chance to learn on a regular basis from Richard. Very, very powerful newsletter type of format to where he keeps you abreast, and just tremendous knowledge of the Fed. And then you can drop by, if you want to take that knowledge and put it to use, drop by yourinvestingclass.com. Richard has a talent for having a pulse on the data, and I would hope that my talent is to help people turn that into cash flow. So we've got a good 1-2 punch here, I think, Richard. And I'll begin by just thanking you for taking time to be on the podcast today.
Andy, it's so great to be back with you. Thank you for having me back on the show.
So Richard lives in Thailand, and he has been able to, in California we've had fire, and in Thailand they've had flood. And the time difference is interesting because when I get up in the morning and get ready to roll, it's time for you to hit the hay. So we appreciate you burning the midnight oil for us, but we're just getting rolling in the morning. So thank you for being here once again. I gave a little bit of your background, and you and I met in Singapore. I think it was probably, I'm going to say 2008-ish is going to be my guess, somewhere around in there. And the subprime meltdown began to go into full swing. And my first memory of speaking on stage with you, it was a good size room, and we'd made a tour of Singapore, Malaysia, and Australia. And I remember in all three of them, I mean, there were thousands of people, and I never saw a guy get a standing ovation for showing people how the world was going to end economically. But you're the author of several books. You really understand currency, and so you've written books on currency. You've written books on money printing. With that, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to, be one of the foremost authorities really in the world on macroeconomics.
So I went to Vanderbilt University, and after I finished Vanderbilt, I was really lucky and got to backpack around the world for a year. I first went to France, found a job as a chauffeur in Paris, and made enough money to keep traveling around the world for more than a year. And on that trip, I saw Asia, Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore for a couple of months. And already it was booming economically. So I realized, that's the land of the future. So I went back to business school at Babson College for a couple of years. And when I finished that with an MBA, I flew to Hong Kong and found a job working for a Hong Kong Chinese stockbroking company as a securities analyst. And I've spent most of my career in Asia since then, as a securities analyst, then as an economist, a strategist. I watched the Asia miracle happen and then implode in the Asia crisis. And by that point, I was the head of research in Thailand for Salomon Brothers. And I started calling up and harassing the World Bank and the IMF and the Treasury Department. And I finally got a consulting job with the IMF, and then the World Bank hired me, and I moved to Washington for a couple of years. And then moved back to Asia. After a while, I ended up as the head of global investment strategy for ABN AMRO Asset Management, based in London, looking at all the asset classes globally. And along the way, I've written 4 books. The first one was The Dollar Crisis, 20 years ago. The most recent one, a couple of years ago, was called The Money Revolution, How to Finance the Next American Century. And now my business is Macro Watch. It's a video newsletter. Every couple of weeks I upload a new video discussing something important happening in the global economy and how it's likely to impact everyone's wealth.
Just speaking of Macro Watch, I don't apologize at all for advertising that and recommending it for people. Our students at the Cashflow Academy in particular have found, and I've gotten the feedback from them, have found huge value in that. You've always been kind whenever you speak to our audience to offer discounts. So let's just right out of the gate, where can they go to learn about Macro Watch? And you usually have a secret month of the year that if you know the secret month, you can get a discount.
Right, so if they visit my website, which is richardduncaneconomics.com, they can take a look and see what's there. And if they hit the subscribe button, and they'll be prompted to put in a coupon code. If they use the coupon code April, they can subscribe at a 50% discount. So I think they'll find that very affordable. And after that, they'll get a couple of videos from me every month and have immediate access to more than 100 hours of videos in the Macro Watch archives. Macro Watch has been going on now for more than 11 years. And with Macro Watch, you will learn how the financial markets and the economy really work now in this new age when money is no longer backed by gold. It doesn't work the way that it used to.
That's for sure, and that's a great segue actually into our discussion. I think I'll begin here. There have been bubbles, and as a fundamental analyst, and even as a technical analyst, but more so when I try to pretend that I'm a fundamental analyst, I see a detachment often both ways from prices, from fundamentals, and these can be inflated to where, for example, right now, if we were to look at a Shiller PE index and we were to see what the amount of money people are paying for earnings, relative to the S&P 500,
right.
we're bumping up close to the all-time high. There's only been one time in history, and that was a dot-com era where no one was making any money. The prices were high in speculating for growth, but the earnings certainly weren't there at the time, and we're approaching those types of realms. And so when people are willing to pay so much for potential as opposed to real earnings, there's a loss of fear. And when I see what Shiller coined irrational exuberance, where we are so excited, where there's just not enough fear to keep us grounded, this detachment from prices can become profound. And I think about the 401k person in the United States, that they put the same amount in each time. Well, they're buying less shares with this set amount of their paycheck being peeled off, but they're also getting less value in terms of earnings. Now, we'll talk about AI and the potential of that to boost the earnings. We'll talk about that. But there have been bubbles throughout time where, and I've only lived through a few of them. I was in high school when the late 1980s bubble hit, and that was a short bubble, lasted one day and started to build back up, the crash. .com, I was very much involved in investing in .com crash. Subprime meltdown of 08, 09-ish, around in there, the global financial crisis, certainly was in tune to that. And then most recently, we had a beautiful pullback with COVID that was the best year and the best opportunities I ever picked up, having been the most experienced I've ever been at that time. So now, I don't know that we've kicked the can down the road, but I feel that with the amount of debt that is needed and the credit expansion that is needed to keep growth going, that we've rolled quite a snowball up the hill. Some people call this an everything bubble, that the next big one we're going to hit has elements of inflated prices everywhere and tremendous amounts of of derivatives that are codependent around the world. So that was a big mouthful, a lot of words I just spit out there. But that's to lay the context for this simple question. Tell us what people think the everything bubble is. Tell us what you think the everything bubble is, and we'll start there.
Well, I think you've described it pretty well. I mean, as you said, the CAPE PE multiple ratio is near all-time record highs. And not only that, but one I look at closely is something I call the wealth to income ratio. And it measures the total wealth of all the Americans divided by personal disposable income. So it's wealth to income. And wealth has just absolutely exploded over just since 2019. The wealth of all of the Americans has gone up in just 5 years by $52 trillion. That is a 44% increase in total wealth. To put that into perspective, that is enough to pay off the entire US government debt with $16 trillion left over. So wealth has just absolutely exploded. And unfortunately, the income has not gone up enough to support these inflated asset prices. So this wealth to income ratio, the long-term average has been about 550%. It went up to 620% in 2000 in the NASDAQ bubble, and then it popped and went back to its long-term norm. Then in the property bubble, it went up to 680%, and then it popped and went back to its long-term norm. Now it's off the charts. It's up to 780%, which is telling us that asset prices are extremely inflated and very vulnerable to any potential shock. That's not just stocks, but also home prices and commodity prices and crypto prices and essentially everything, the everything bubble. And almost everything has been aligned perfectly to make asset prices go higher for the last many years. I mean, first of all, we had the extraordinary stimulus from COVID, right? The COVID government response, $5 trillion of deficit spending from the government, financed with $5 trillion of paper money creation by the Fed. And then even after that ended, the large budget deficits continued. We've had near $2 trillion budget deficits for the last two plus years, and it looks like it's going to be the same again this year. So the very large government spending has been stimulating the economy. And then we had very high rates of inflation, but more recently they've come down from a peak of 9% to less than 3%. So this got everyone very excited in the markets. Falling inflation meant the Fed could start cutting interest rates, and they did. They cut interest rates by 100 basis points so far, and they were expected to continue cutting interest rates further. So as with expectations of lower interest rates, stock prices went higher. And then there were things like waves of immigrants coming in illegally. And that stimulated the economy. These people consumed and boosted economic growth that way. And they also held down wages by providing cheap labor. And that made the inflation rate come down and the interest rates come down. And then there were so many other things on top of that. I mean, for instance, the U.S. has a very big trade deficit. And when the U.S. has a trade deficit, it has a very big capital inflows. The capital inflows must equal the current account deficit. The balance of payments has to balance. So the bigger the current account deficit became, the bigger the capital inflows became. And the more money that came into the U.S., that money pushed up stock prices, it pushed up bond prices, it pushed down interest rates. And that stimulated the economy. And then we had the AI mania.
That's a big one. 2 years
ago, ChatGPT arrived, and wow, it's been spectacular. It changes the way I work. I use it every day. I mean, it's just a total game changer, and it's going to get better and better and better very quickly. And so all of the AI-related companies have done spectacularly well. The Mag 7, and they've driven the stock prices higher. And I'm not sure, and then we mentioned wealth already. Of course, with this explosion of wealth, that supported consumption. And as people spent more, that supported economic growth. And as the economy grew, that supported the wealth creation. So it's just been one big spectacular upward spiral of great things happening that have been pushing asset prices higher and higher. But I'm really afraid that now, going into this year, all of these drivers that have been pushing asset prices higher, it looks like so many of them are going to stop, and quite a few of them potentially go into reverse. And so I'm afraid 2025 very well may be the year that the everything bubble pops.
You mentioned AI, and I think that's a fascinating thing because, I really love when it comes to turning these things into cash. I love the story of Levi Strauss. Levi Strauss was obviously a benefit of the gold rush. And so when people would go to California to mine for gold, they needed blue jeans to do it. And so they cashed in on the gold rush. And the nice thing is, it had nothing to do with whether a person found gold or not. It had to do with participation in the rush. And I often look at crypto the same way. I have some crypto, not a lot, not like my colleagues have gone in and, they've made themselves look good thus far. But, I own utility stocks, and I produce the electricity that allows that to survive. I have shares of Apple, so I provide the hardware for them to look at their screen and trade their crypto. I have Verizon Wireless, so I own the network at which and I've even dabbled with certain like Coinbase. Whether it goes up or down, I'm going to make money off the participation of this. Well, I think about AI the same way. A lot of people think the AI cash-in is going to be, the NVIDIA or, whoever, and even the quantum computing research at IBM or Google or Apple. But really, I don't care if a guy makes paper clips. AI will make every business more productive. And when you talk about GDP, gross domestic product, AI will expand that product, the amount of things we can actually generate and produce. So the big bet and the big question in my mind is this feels very 1990s to me. When the internet came into our lives, everyone knew it was big. Everyone knew it would change the world in terms of productivity, but we couldn't pick out the FANG trade before the winners and losers were settled. And I think it's very much the same. We had news coming out of China, an app that was able to pull off some pretty impressive AI without the chips we thought we had to have. And, the word is they spent millions, not billions, to develop this, and they spent months, not years, to catch up. So, yeah, I agree. It's a Wild West time. And I remember in the 90s, when the internet boom occurred, people weren't talking about the money they made. They were talking about the money they've raised. They weren't talking about what they'd actually done. They talked about what they planned on doing. And this fear of missing out, this revolution just sucked money into these things in a huge way. And that's part of what created the dot-com bubble, was the idea of opportunity. And it feels like that to me a little bit. There's going to be a FANG trade of some kind. There's going to be, it's not, is it Alta Vista? Is it Ask Jeeves? Is it Yahoo? No, it was Google, and they won. And the same thing will happen with cryptos, and the same thing will happen with AI. But a person generally would have done well to believe in the internet generally and believe that would increase productivity. The other comment I'll make, that I loved your metric of wealth to income, because income is a little bit harder to fake. When you tell me what my income is, I have to show receipts of money that flowed, and it's a cash flow idea, where wealth is a net worth idea on a balance sheet, and that can be fickle, because wealth, you can look at a fluctuation of a home price or a stock price or anything, and it has a lot to do with how much money people have to bid up those prices. And so if money becomes more scarce, it's more difficult for them to bid up those prices because they don't have the money to buy them. So I agree that the unprecedented boom of wealth, perhaps I could put it in these terms. If a person gets a statement from their 401k, it's denominated in dollars. That's quite a deceptive denomination, because what they really have is inventory that theoretically could be sold at that price today. In other words, they have an inventory of mutual funds. Those are not real dollars that they're looking at. It is an opinion. It is a measure of the current market's opinion of those mutual funds should they be liquidated today. A person who has a stock account, they're very careful often in how they discuss what your balance is. They call it a net liquidation value, which I think is a wonderful term, because if I have a net liquidation value of several $1 million, well, that's just saying that's the opinion of what you have as of today, and it certainly could change tomorrow if there were less money. Any comments on the idea of the fickleness and the instability of a net worth number of wealth as opposed to the difficulty of actually having a cash flow towards you with income?
Well, yes, it becomes increasingly fickle the higher the ratio is on it, the higher the PE ratio or the higher the wealth to income ratio. And so it's very vulnerable now, this idea of wealth, because suddenly all of these factors that were supporting the expansion of the valuations are now being challenged. I mean, we now have a new administration, and of course I wish the new administration to be very successful in terms of driving economic growth in the economy. But we have to look at what they have told us that they're going to do. And this begins with tariffs, which could come into effect very soon, and deportations on a very large scale, and tax cuts. Now, all of those things, could potentially drive inflation.
They're deflationary. Oh, you think they're inflationary?
Absolutely. Tariffs would, the tariffs are paid by the American corporations who import things from other countries, and they pass them on to their consumers. The deportations, there has been talk of deporting 11 million people. That's just 7% of the U.S. workforce. If you deport 7% of the U.S. workforce, then there's going to be a labor shortage. We already have a labor shortage. The unemployment rate is only 4.1%. So if you do deport a large number of people, that is going to push up wages, and wages will drive up inflation. And if you
100%.
You cut taxes, that's going to stimulate the economy and make the economy grow faster. And stronger economic growth creates more demand, and that will also push up inflation. So if we suddenly move from an environment where we were expecting more rate cuts, the Fed had signaled up until September that last year they were expecting to cut the federal funds rate down to 2.6% by the end of next year. But suddenly, people are afraid we're going to have inflation again. And so the Fed has put a pause on further rate cuts for the moment anyway. They cut rates 100 basis points. But the markets had already priced in significantly further rate cuts on the belief that inflation would continue to fall. And it's now very uncertain that inflation will continue to fall. In fact, if these policies are carried out, it's quite likely that inflation will rise. And if inflation rises, instead of the Fed cutting interest rates, it's very likely the Fed's going to begin hiking interest rates sometime in the middle or second part of this year. And if that happens, that's going to be very painful on the stock market and other asset prices as well. And we've already seen the market determined interest rates like government bond yields and mortgage rates. They've already moved up 100 basis points since September, despite the fact the Fed has cut by that much the federal funds rate since September. So the market is telling us that the market is beginning to price in higher interest rates. So that's the worst thing that could happen for this very vulnerable everything bubble. But there are a lot of other bad things that are potentially going to happen to it as well, I'm afraid. Secondly, we can talk about spending cuts. Of course, everyone is in favor of reducing wasteful government spending where possible. But we've had Elon Musk, the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE,
right.
tell us he wants to cut $1 trillion from government spending. We know that the GDP is only made up of four things. It's made up of personal consumption expenditure, how much normal people spend. business investment, government spending, and net trade. Add those four things together, and that's the size of the economy. If you cut government spending by $1 trillion, the economy immediately shrinks by $1 trillion. Plus, there's a multiplier on that, which actually causes it to shrink by more. So if that occurs on anywhere near that scale, that alone will be enough to throw the U.S. into a recession, and that would cause a significant sell-off in the stock market.
You have, there's so much educational opportunity for a listener in this particular podcast. In my opinion, our conversation is dense with educational nutrient. For example, the idea that tariffs bring friction to trade. It brings it inhibits trade, and thus raises prices. And if you look at COVID, one of the lessons you can learn, if you're listening, is you think about the idea that globalization is deflationary. And if you end trade because of COVID, you got things that are nearshore, things that are not moving. That causes inflation because goods become more scarce. They're harder to get. So if you want lower prices, you want to, in the same way you might have an undocumented worker that will work for less, well, the people in China will work for less as well. And so if you begin to inhibit the ability for people to work for less, you've got to pay more for labor, and there you pass that on to the consumer. So there's tremendous. I think that there's some a degree of bite to President Trump's tariff talk. I think a lot of it is also posturing and possibly saber rattling, but there's no question that when Colombia wouldn't take his plane, he said, well, if you don't do what I'm telling you, we'll tariff you. Canada, tariff. And so he's certainly using tariffs as an economical weapon, really, or economical chess piece might be a better way to phrase it, that can really affect things. So I'm concerned about tariffs because I do believe, as you do, that globalization is deflationary. Another deflationary thing that's interesting is technology, though. Technology is tremendously deflationary in that, if I tried to take my iPhone that's $1,000 today and perform the same amount of work in production in 1980, that thing probably cost me, tens of thousands of dollars, really. So, better battery life, better capability, better technology, AI can help be a deflationary force and a driver of economics. What might be interesting, where people might see a strange difference in us, is where you'll say, I'm really afraid that this everything bubble could come, and I'm nervous this should fall, and I'm just hoping for it. I'm rooting for it. And the reason is when you take, this is why I think Macro Watch and the Cashflow Academy make such a great 1-2 punch for people. Because the reality of it is if I'm a consumer and my goal is to buy consumables, I'm going to be anticipating Black Friday the day after Thanksgiving. And I will be up in the morning and out to the mall, and I can't wait to get on my computer for Cyber Monday because I'm anticipating my ability to acquire these consumables at low prices. Well, I'm not so much as a consumer in my life, I'm a net producer, meaning that if you took my personal life and you looked at gasoline consumption, there'll be a certain amount of outflow at the gas pump, but there's a greater amount of inflow from dividends and ExxonMobil income and things related to that. So when it comes to petroleum, I'm actually a net producer. So I want to buy assets, I want to buy things that create wealth, and I don't like buying things when the market's high. I hate this market. I can't stand, having to search harder for these assets at these inflated prices. I'm waiting for, consumers like Black Friday, investors like Black Swan. And I cannot wait for the everything bubble, because every time, if you look at a long-term stock chart and you say, okay, if I had to do over again, when would I want to buy? You'd pick the troughs every time, and you'd pick the major troughs that come because they're going on sale. The key to this is also being able to make money on the downside to hedge what I have and fill coffers with cash to reinvest where I don't want to sell my stuff, let it fall, but I need to have cash and the ability to pick up bargains if an everything bubble, if we're lucky enough to have a reset. And it's a good feeling to get prices back in line with what they should be and take the inflation out. So, it's an interesting perspective, is it not?
You're right. I mean, bargains are always welcome. But here's my concern, Andy. I mean, I think this bubble that we have is so extraordinarily large that it's a global bubble. It's unprecedented. And it's driven by credit creation.
Yes. Please talk about that. Please talk about the requirement, and I hope people feel the cutting edge of the word required, the requirement of credit expansion to keep the machine running. Speak a little bit on that.
Our economic system is driven by credit expansion. And if credit doesn't grow by at least 2% every year adjusted for inflation, the U.S. goes into recession. And if credit contracts, which it only did in the beginning of 2009, and everything almost melted down, if credit contracts, we have a depression. So total credit, which is equal to total debt, all the debt of all the sectors of the economy, the government debt, the household debt, the corporate debt, Fannie and Freddie debt, all the debt in the country. It first went through $1 trillion in 1964. Now it is $101 trillion. So we've had a 100-fold expansion of debt in my lifetime. And this has created the greatest economic bubble in history. So during that process, the U.S. trade deficit exploded from zero to, it will be $1.1 trillion this year. That is, and the cumulative deficit, since this got underway in the early 1980s, the cumulative trade deficit has been about $16 to $17 trillion. That our deficit has thrown this money off into the surplus countries like Japan first, and then Taiwan and Thailand, where I watched the bubble happen, and then China and Vietnam, and blew all those countries into a bubble. And in the process, it created the greatest economic boom in history. It's pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But this bubble almost popped in 2008. Almost all the banks failed then. And it required massive government stimulus to make your bargains pay off. Otherwise, your bargains would have become worthless. Whatever you paid for, they would have lost 100% of their value. And then we had that again in 2020 with COVID. If the government had not intervened, this global bubble would have popped. So this bubble is so enormously large. If it pops, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm serious. I'm not sure that our civilization would survive. Things are pretty tense politically in the U.S. and in Europe and many places around the world, even at a time when the economy is really quite strong, in the U.S. at least. Can you imagine what would happen if the U.S. GDP started spiraling downward 5 or 10%, and the unemployment rate went up to 25%, like in the Great Depression? That's what popping of this everything bubble means. And if the government didn't jump in quickly enough to stop that from happening, in other words, by doing the opposite of everything they want to do, instead of cutting spending, this would require another $5 or $10 trillion of government debt and another $5 or $10 trillion of credit creation, money creation by the Fed. So if this bubble pops, again, I don't know if our civilization can survive it. And you better be careful at what price you buy the bargains, because there's always a 100% you can lose from there.
Brilliantly said, wonderfully said on two fronts. And I trust our listenership is sophisticated enough to grasp what you just said, but I would like to comment on it further to make 100% sure they grasp it. The first salient point that you made was that these bubbles almost popped. The perception of most people is that the dot-com bubble popped and that the subprime bubble popped and that the COVID bubble popped. These were not resets that found their way to true valuation necessarily. it was as if it isn't that they kicked a can down the road. That's a poor metaphor. They rolled a snowball up the hill. So what happened was they rolled a snowball up the hill, it gains mass and it gains potential energy. So when it does start to reverse the other way, oh my goodness, do you have an amazing event. So the idea that the bubble still exists and that it has grown from a dot-com bubble, from a subprime bubble into an everything bubble is a profound insight and perspective that I share actually with you.
Because and it's been fueled by the government debt.
Yes, and it's been fueled by money printing and debt. The second point
now let's go into reverse.
Yeah, the second point that you made that we could draw an analogy to make it more clear is that credit expansion enables purchase and investment. For example, if all of a sudden I said we're going to outlaw mortgages where you can't borrow money to buy a house, well, a person's ability to buy a house would be curtailed, decelerated, even to an inability, and you would see real estate prices completely collapse if you said no more mortgages. If you decide that education's important and you begin to create one of the worst debts ever, what is worse than a zero down, no doc stated income loan in the real estate world? I will tell you, it's called a student loan. Those people don't even have a job. They don't have any collateral. 60% of them might graduate. 40% might not. It takes them 6 years instead of 4 to get it done, so it increases. And so if you enable people to borrow money for education, what will happen to tuition? It goes through the roof. And so it is the credit expansion that drives these prices up because it's an enabler and an accelerator of purchasing power. And so the important thing to know, and then the third point I think you made is what I often refer to as moving from civil to primal. And we've seen instances where the United States has done well and where they haven't. For example, in 9/11, there was very little reporting. There was some, but there was very little reporting of looting and in the chaos, and all of your first responders are in one area, and it would have been open season for thievery. So they did pretty well there. But Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, we were not so lucky. And even in the fires in California, we're not so lucky. So when the COVID kind of showed some of our colors, it was almost like a dry run of riots, of demonstration, of the vandalizing businesses, the raiding of businesses, where we had a moment under pressure where we showed a little bit of our hand and our true colors of how quickly we will move from a civil mindset to a primal mindset, where there can be civil unrest. It's a very, very interesting. It's time to get your popcorn and watch this movie unfold because it's going to be dramatic, for sure. You have one comment, then we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk about how. When we come back, we're going to talk about how Richard affected my mind and gave me an interesting paradigm shift. But you just looked like you had one more comment before the break.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that Elon Musk understands the importance that credit growth plays in preventing this bubble from imploding. He sees a lot of government inefficiency and wants to slash it and cut $1 trillion off the government spending. But what he doesn't realize is that would create a downward spiral that could easily lead before long to bank failures on a very large scale. And at that point, the government has a choice. Do you let one bank fail and then all the banks fail and result in a 1930s style Great Depression? Or do you intervene by pumping in a lot of new government money again? So rather than slashing the government spending, fine, save money where money's being wasted, but we need to understand that our economic system must have credit growth. And so the wiser approach would be to have the government borrow and invest in new industries and technologies so that we can be sure to win this AI space race that we're in with China and create technological, medical marvels and miracles and this sort of investment would turbocharge the economy. So that's the policy I'm most excited about that President Trump has put forward. President Trump has come out in support of establishing a U.S. sovereign wealth fund to invest in new industries and new technologies. And he's also made clear that he would like for the U.S. government to own a 50% stake in TikTok, which is a fantastic idea. That way, if the government actually has a stake in these investments, then when these companies become enormously profitable, that means the U.S. taxpayers has a stake in these companies. And by investing and taking equity stakes in joint ventures with the private sector, with the government providing the financing and the private sector providing the managerial talent, entrepreneurial brilliance, and the scientific know-how, this sort of investment through a sovereign wealth fund has the potential to keep the economy not only growing, but growing at a much faster rate than it has in recent years, and at the same time creating such technological breakthroughs that it would turbocharge U.S. economic growth, and at the same time shore up U.S. national security, which is now really gravely threatened by China. So I'm afraid the people in favor of austerity are going to win out, and instead of the forward and more aggressive investment strategy, where we invest and grow our way out of the bubble rather than sitting back and letting the bubble implode with catastrophic consequences. It's better to invest and grow our way out and keep the bubble expanding, or at least make the economy grow into the bubble so that the bubble doesn't implode.
So you've done this is a great teaser for our second segment for the next part of our conversation. When we come back from this break, we're going to talk more about the idea of investment by government, ownership by government. We're going to talk more about money printing, Fed policy, when we come back. So stay tuned for a short little commercial break, and I'll be back with Richard Duncan.
They make different topics that could be complex very simple. You're going to learn at your own pace. The more that you want to learn, the more you can learn. It's been amazing for me personally, as well as me taking the subject matter and teaching it to my children. They're all very passionate about what it is they're teaching and how they teach it, and it just comes across as so genuine. If it's something that you're interested in, then certainly they're the best teachers that I've run across in terms of teaching fiscal education.
Welcome back to the Cashflow Academy Podcast. I'm Andy Tanner. This is where we do our best to make investing simple. My special guest, is my good friend of many, many years, Richard Duncan. He and I enjoy our conversations so much because when I go to Thanksgiving dinner, I don't get to talk about these things. You know, I always tease they want to talk about Lindsay Lohan's parole status or something. They're not interested in macroeconomics. I'm going to speak a little bit to, you did a great job actually reading my mind to set up this segment and talking about investment. And what I like to bring to the 1-2 punch of Andy and Richard is I like to take these concepts and turn them into wealth and cash flow. And one of the most important things an investor can study is currency denotes movement. One of the most interesting metrics that I'll go to the St. Louis Fed and they have all those wonderful charts there. I love the velocity of money, which is really a metric of how a dollar changes hands. And is it a month before a dollar changes hands? Is it a quarter before a dollar changes hands? So not only is the amount of currency and the volume of currency in circulation of interest, certainly the velocity at which that changes hands is of tremendous interest. Another thing that's important about cash flow, in my new book, I'm rewriting 401 Chaos, is I do my best to teach people how to understand that winners and losers are discovered by tracking, much like a detective, tracking cash flow and where it winds up. So for example, this mentality can change how a person feels. For example, when COVID came out, a lot of people just flat out got some checks. I mean, it was helicopter money. They said, here's a check because you can't pay your rent, and here's a check because you can't go to work and you don't have income coming in, so here's a check. And I didn't get those checks. And my son says, well, Dad, why didn't we get a check? I go, well, there's a certain strata, economic strata, and those at the top, towards the top of the strata, they don't get the checks. The bottom of the strata gets checks. They go, that's not fair. I said, son, it's the most beautiful thing we could ask for. Because if you track the cash flow, the moment those checks go out, they're going to be used to pay rent. And that goes into our pockets because we own the real estate. They're going to go to they're going to go to Costco and they're going to buy Heinz ketchup, and that means a dividend to me because I'm the one selling the ketchup. And they're going to pay their cell phone bill, and that's money to us because we own Verizon Wireless, and they might even go out and splurge on the new Apple phone if they get enough stimulus, and that money goes to us as owners of Apple. And as you look in the shopping cart at Costco, you just go to Costco. That's all you got to do is watch what direction the money flows. And it is a predictable event that on Saturday, there'll be crowds of people standing in line to hand the people who produce money in order to consume. So I'm a huge fan of money printing because if I have real estate debt and the value of my liability column is being reduced because the dollars I owe are less valuable, my net worth grows. Any reduction in the liability column is an increase of net worth. In essence, by borrowing personally a currency that will fall in value, I'm taking a short position on the U.S. dollar. And so anyone who uses personal debt to acquire assets in anticipation that money or currency will lose value, they're effectively shorting the dollar, and they're paying back those dollars when they're worth less. I didn't say worthless, I said worth less. So the idea of being an investor, you do have to concern yourselves with social to primal. That's a very real thing to consider. And when you talk about one of the skills I think I can help people with is as asset prices begin to fall in a COVID, and as asset prices begin to fall in a bubble, do we have to get the very bottom? No, we don't. At that point, we change from technical analysis to fundamentals because I can have a good judgment with certain fundamental education skills of when value starts to come alive again. When there's value in that stock again, I might not get the bottom, but I can get a great price that I can have confidence. Because if you look at the Depression, which had high unemployment, awful time, my grandfather would tell me stories, people still needed food, clothing, shelter, and I would add today medicine, and I would add today technology and energy. I think the energy sector, the technology sector are as much staples. People can live without a house, but a homeless guy has a phone. So it's an interesting time, and I don't want to, arrogance is a scary thing. I don't want to be pompous as I anticipate the bubble. I want to be smart, calculated, and educated. And education is life. Now, let me deliver on my promise where Richard Duncan really had me thinking. You brought a deeper level to my thinking with this thought. So I'll ask you to bear with some long-windedness to set up this epiphany that you gave me, because I think whether people agree with you or not, it has to be tremendous food for thought. So here's my thinking. One of the quotes that I have in my office is from Steve Jobs, and he says, "Don't be trapped by dogma." In other words, if we embrace orthodoxy, we put ourselves within walls where we don't get to think outside orthodoxy. That's the dogma trap, where someone in authority declares something is so, and they say it's that way just because it's that way. I'll give you an example of financial dogma that is harmful. And I'll actually name names. I'm not scared to get to pick a fight with David Ramsey. I'm not scared to pick a fight with him, or Susie for that, Susie Orman. Someone approached David Ramsey, and he is dogmatically rigid about being debt-free. He sees debt as an evil thing and not a good thing. He sees it as a moral flaw to use debt, as if you should never play with matches, where you forego the life-giving light, heat, cooking, warmth that a fire can give you if it's controlled properly and used from a standpoint of utility rather than morality. So someone went to David Ramsey and they said, Dave, if I gave you a 10-year loan for $1 billion interest-free, would you take it? And of course, you and I would take that in a second and buy some T-bills, and instantly we would do it. But Dave says, no, I would not do the debt. And I would say, you're looking at debt through a lens of dogma that you just don't do it and that it's bad, rather than the utility of how the debt could be used. And much like fire, it could burn you, but it could also save you from hypothermia and death. It could be life-taking, but it could be life-saving, depending on the lens of utility and the skill with which it's applied. Well, I had been very dogmatic about printing money, which is really a derivative that exists behind borrowing. If I issue bonds, the Fed can, with a keystroke, acquire those bonds and money is created, or via debt and fractional reserve lending. Money can be created in a lot of ways. And the idea that if you print money out of nothing seems morally wrong. It seems that, well, how can you just, I work so hard for my money. How can they just invent it out of nothing? That seems morally wrong. When I play in a basketball tournament for old men, and it's an alumni tournament, so I might be lined up against a guy 25 years younger than me. Well, the rule is that for every year older I am than that, my opponent, I get to start with a point on the ledger. And so the referee can do nothing about it. The scorekeeper simply, without a basket source, simply enters 25 points. For every year older I am than this guy, they start me with 25 points. And the guy there says, that's not fair. There was no basket behind this. And guess what? This is fiat points. We declare them to be so, and those points are real, and they do enable me to win the game. And I need those points, Richard. I need them. So you changed my thinking about this when it comes to money creation, because what if I look at money creation, two sides of every coin, intelligence exists at the edge, and I say, what if I looked at money creation through the same lens of utility that I looked at debt? In other words, what if I shed the dogma of money printing's bad, and I say, what would happen if we went further and said, could money printing be akin to fire, to where with the right utility it could be life-saving instead of life-ending and imploding? Because right now, the U.S. federal budget has a tremendous amount of spending and borrowing to sustain it in what we would call income stability. In other words, they're spending money, and that money flows through that part of the economic strata, those members, and it flows and creates a wealth gap. If we spend $1 trillion on income stability through Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, pensions, to give people the ability to have health care, to give people the ability to spend money, track the cash flow. It goes into the pockets of the wealthy, because when they go to Costco, that money is transferred in the pockets of producing. And so if you look and you say, well, instead of printing all this money to reduce the value of their savings accounts and increase the value of my businesses, what if we spent money for investment? What if instead of investing to help them pay their medical bills for Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, what if we invested to eliminate those expenses? What if we cured cancer, cured Alzheimer's, cured this through massive investment? Then that $200 trillion off-balance sheet liability of unfunded liabilities the United States faces shrinks because they have to spend less. And what if we have a Sputnik moment? So that's kind of long-winded, but it really, your last book really talked about using money printing as a vehicle for investment rather than a vehicle just to help people consume and stay alive. And that investment idea is an interesting one. And then I'll say one more thing. I'm going to shut up and let you talk. The other thing I think is interesting about this is if you look at the debt to GDP ratio historically in the United States, you'd know this better than I would, but I'd put my money on World War II, to where you have a threat, Germany, Nazi Germany, Japan, you have a World War threat to where the cause of freedom had to be funded. And so if I go to David Ramsey and I say, you don't think we should go into debt? And he says, no. I says, okay, well, how are you going to fund a war for your survival if you don't accelerate your ability to defend yourself? There is probably no better reason for invoking the acceleration and enabling power of debt than survival of your own country. And so now we have this Sputnik moment where, we have a space race and Kennedy says, we got to go to the moon. We got to beat Russia to the moon. That prize is nearly insignificant compared to the prize of AI and the battle for AI. And so the idea to invest, print, the prize of AI is such an economic powerhouse that to get there first could warrant unprecedented debt and unprecedented spending, because the prize could be a sort of economic survival. Now, I was long-winded, but I had to give you the proper credit. Yeah, exactly. I had to give you the proper credit by saying, it really changed how I think. I don't know what the right thing is yet, but I love looking at the other side of the coin, and I hate dogma, and I like the idea of examining debt and money creation from the lens of utility. I'll give you the floor to comment on how you feel about those notions, because I know you're very passionate about it in your latest book.
Right. Well, I think it would be very helpful for me to explain the evolution of my thinking over the last 25 years.
Please.
Starting off 25, 30 years ago, I would say I was mostly influenced by the Austrian school
You're
of
an austerity. Yeah.
which is pretty much conventional wisdom, I think, among most Americans these days. That's what people seem to believe. And so when I wrote The Dollar Crisis, my first book, it came out in 2003, I could see that there was a bubble forming in the United States, because I just come from a big bubble blowing up in Asia, and I could see the same thing happening in the US. And I thought this bubble was going to inevitably, it was being fueled by credit. I thought the bubble was going to inevitably pop and lead to a depression. And well, the bubble did pop in 2007, right? And 2008. But what I didn't foresee, what I didn't imagine, I couldn't see this as conceivable at all. We didn't collapse into a depression, because out of nowhere, the Fed, which of course has the power to create money, the Fed created $3.5 trillion over the next 4 years to finance a equally large amount of increasing government debt. And this combination of government spending, which should have, all the additional government borrowing should have pushed up interest rates and made the depression worse. But when you have the Fed creating money and buying all of these government bonds, it made it possible for this stimulus to stimulate the economy and prevent this bubble from imploding. So the bubble didn't implode. And as it turned out, because of globalization, which was in full swing then, we didn't get high rates of inflation, despite all of this government spending and this $3.5 trillion of paper money creation in a short period of time. The highest rate of inflation that we got was in 2011. And at that point, the inflation rate was 3.8%. That was the peak. And by the early months of 2015, we had deflation again for a few months. So this rocked my entire conception of how economics works in the post-Bretton Woods era, in the post-gold standard era. What it told me is that, okay, I knew we had a bubble. We still have a bubble. The government was very successful in reflating the bubble, and hats off to them. We avoided a complete economic collapse, we avoided a replay of the Great Depression, a replay of the Depression of the 1930s, which was followed by World War II in the 40s. That may be the world we would be living in now if they had not responded with this paper money creation. So, okay, we've got a big new tool in the toolkit. It is money creation that is possible in a world of globalization, because the U.S. economy has been dropped into a global ocean, and the global economy has a workforce that is 24 times larger than the U.S. workforce. And this is extremely disinflationary. And this is the thing that allowed the government to get away with this reflating the U.S. economy with fiscal trillion-dollar deficits and trillions of dollars of money creation without creating high rates of inflation. So I began to think, when I saw that this works so well, that, well, if this is indeed the case, that the government can have trillion-dollar budget deficits, and the Fed can finance these by creating trillions of dollars without causing high rates of inflation, then this is a different economic environment completely than we were taught. This is not the 19th century. This is not the era of Ludwig von Mises, when credit inevitably led to bubbles that inevitably popped into crises. We had a bubble, it didn't pop. And so how does our new economic system work? Well, first of all, we have to understand that it's being driven by credit growth, and we have to understand that it's being directed by the government. If things start to go bad, the government's going to jump in and reflate the bubble by creating money and having even more government debt. So here are our options. We either keep this bubble inflated and growing, or we allow it to implode. Those are the two options. Which one do you choose? Now, the people who believe that we have sinned, the wages of sin are death, and we almost suffer for our sins, and so we need to have a little recession. It'll be tough for a couple of years, and everything will be fine, and we'll be back in some sort of laissez-faire Garden of Eden. Well, that's just not true. If this bubble pops, it's going to be at least as bad as the Depression, and probably worse, because we have $100 trillion of credit now. Our whole world is floating on top of this credit. So my option is to keep the bubble inflated, but do it sensibly. Have the government borrow money, and if necessary, have the Fed print money to finance the government borrowing, and then take this government borrowing, and instead of wasting it on unnecessary wars and crazy government programs, let's invest it very aggressively in new industries and new technologies through joint ventures with the private sector. So that is what a sovereign wealth fund is, a U.S. sovereign wealth fund that President Trump said he intended to establish in a speech in September at the Economic Club of New York. He said he wanted to establish a U.S. sovereign wealth fund. And this is a brilliant idea. This is the way forward for our country. We don't want our economic system to implode into chaos and barbarism. We want to keep the civilization that we have. We just want to make it more prosperous. And by investing aggressively in new industries and new technologies, we can do that. So the government would provide the financing in a joint venture company with, let's just say, theoretically, just for sake of an example, the government could form joint venture companies, 10,000 of them, with the most promising American entrepreneurs and scientists. The government would provide the funding and, in exchange, keep a 60% equity stake. And the entrepreneurs and the scientists would manage these companies, and they would keep a 40% equity stake for managing the companies. And when these companies started creating cures for cancers and Alzheimer's and cheap fusion, which would make energy free essentially, then they would be so enormously profitable, and the government would own 60% of them, meaning that the American public would own 60% of them. So when President Trump says he wants to eliminate the U.S. income tax, well, if you're going to eliminate the income tax, you're going to have some other source of revenue, and tariffs aren't going to provide enough revenue to come anywhere near to do that. But if you invest in new industries and technologies and create trillion-dollar companies and generate revenue year after year that accrues to the U.S. Treasury Department, in other words, to American taxpayers, then we can turbocharge the economy by this sort of government investment. We don't have to allow the economy to implode. We can make it grow, and not only grow at 2% a year, we can make it grow at 5 or 7% a year. And along the way, we can cure all the diseases, radically expand healthy life expectancy, and most importantly, ensure that we're not conquered by China, as we very well may be in the not too distant future, because China is investing so much more aggressively. Their government is investing in new industries and technologies on a much more aggressive scale than our government is. And that's why they're overtaking us technologically now. That's why they had 5G years before we did. That's why they have hypersonic missiles and we don't. That's why they dominate the electric car industry and the electric battery industry. And now they've just come up with this new AI product that's knocked the breath out of Wall Street and taken everyone by complete surprise. DeepSeek, which seems to be as good as, or possibly as good, and an enormous amount cheaper to produce than our best AI models are. And so we must invest, or we might as well surrender to China now, because they are gaining such a technological advantage over us. Within a few years, they're going to have such technological dominance. That means they're going to have military dominance, and we're going to be at their mercy. And so the only way forward is to invest and grow. Now, this may not be the thing that your listeners are focusing on every day in their lives. They want to make money. Well, they need to be aware of the fundamentals of the way the economy works in the 21st century. The way it works is credit growth drives economic growth, and the government's directing the economy. And if credit starts to contract, we start to have a depression, and then the government has to respond. So when you pick your bargains, you pick them at the time when the government jumps back in and starts reflating the bubble. The bargains appear when the bubble starts to deflate, and the time to buy your bargains is when the government intervenes and reflates it. But if some ideologue in government decides, like Dave Ramsey, is that his name? That no,
Yes.
We're not going to increase our government debt. We're just going to, we're going to do it the Herbert Hoover way and bite the bullet. Then everything's going to collapse. I mean everything in our civilization. And I'm not sure if China will be able to survive that sort of crash or not. But if they do, they're going to come out as our conquerors. And, everything that we hold dear will be gone. And hopefully you didn't buy any bargains on the way down, because they'll be denominated in renminbi.
This is reminiscent of Singapore, where you're the only guy I know that can get a standing ovation by spelling out Armageddon to the world. It's fantastic.
So this is the evolution of my thinking. I'm now an Austrian heretic because I don't believe.
I don't know that you're a full-blown Keynesian, but certainly we have to look at things in terms of utility and outcomes instead of dogmatic thinking.
But don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm interested in making money as well. But the bigger picture, the thing that most interests me is trying to make policymakers and the American public understand this danger that we're in. We've got this enormous bubble. If we allow it to pop, it's game over. Forget your investment portfolio. Forget your crypto, your Bitcoin. The electricity is not going to be on.
Even the real estate investors, as I mentioned, is if the dollar gains value, then rents go down and your liability column becomes more valuable. And so if you're highly leveraged yourself as an investor, a strengthening of the dollar where cash is king. In a depression, cash is everything, because the velocity of money is slowed. It can put you in a precarious situation for sure.
Right. If people can't pay their rents, and you don't, and they're not paying you anything, if you have too much debt, you're going down.
Yep.
But in normal circumstances, where the government's going to jump in and save everyone again for the third time, the third time will be the third time, the government will jump in again, and they will have more government debt and more paper money printing, and the bubble won't pop, and so everyone will, and there might be a little inflation, and that will eat away your debt if there is inflation. That's the positive scenario. If the government doesn't come in and save you, then the bottom drops out, everybody loses their jobs, no one pays their rent, and you can't repay your debt, so all the banks fail, and everybody loses their savings, and it's the end of the world.
There is a challenge with expansion, however, because if you look at the Congressional Budget Office, the Treasury, the General Accountability Office, all of these guys put out reports that use the same word in terms of growth, which is unsustainable. And one of the interesting things about compounding, even at a rate of 2%, is over time, any compounding of any positive number, whether it's 0.5%, 1%, 2, or 20, you have a compounding effect that turns into a hockey stick. And the acceleration of that begins to go nuclear, like infinitely growing. And so the idea of prolonged, indefinite 2% target expansion has to deal with the sheer, almost unfathomable concept of compounding an economy where production must keep up with that number of inflation and expansion. It has to keep up with it. A GDP has to grow at a certain rate, and if our GDP is required to grow exponentially, that goes to infinity at some point. That hockey stick changes. So the idea of a balance, figuring out a soft landing, is tough to do, because soft landing, we didn't have a soft landing. We rolled the snowball up the hill, as you've mentioned. And you create a physics problem, a math problem, where you're dealing with the tremendous exponential nature of growth by percentage that's nonlinear. And that is an interesting thing to ponder 30 years, 50 years, because that growth just goes nuclear at some point.
So I have been pondering it for 30 years. And 30 years ago, when President Reagan, I think under Reagan's 8 years in office, the government debt quadrupled in 8 years. Yeah. And people thought that was going to be the end of the world. But the ratio that we're interested in is the ratio of government debt to GDP.
Yes.
Now it is very high. The key to making this work is to make the GDP grow more rapidly than the debt grows. And the way to do that is
by investment.
And then the ratio of government debt to GDP will come down. And we also have to consider another factor, and that's the rate of interest that we have to pay on the government debt. A few years ago, at one point, the government bond yield was down below 1%. And now it's 4.6%. If we have tariffs, very high tariffs, and a big boost of inflation, then that's going to make the interest rates go even higher. But if we allow globalization to do its magic, not necessarily continuing to buy a lot of stuff from China, which is our rival, our trade enemy.
Enemy is a strong word, but we could call it a financial competitor of a formidable financial competitor.
Threatening our national security, then we can buy cheap products from other countries other than China. Put the tariffs on Chinese products, but don't put them on Vietnamese products or Indian products or Bangladesh products, or other places where we can obtain goods cheaply, so that globalization will, these low-wage producers,
curb inflation,
will put inflation down, and that will put interest rates down, and that will lower the cost that we have to pay on our government debt, making it much cheaper to finance this government debt that we do have. So we need to get the inflation down and the interest rates down. And for that, we must have globalization survive. And with these two things, investment, along with globalization and the disinflationary impact that has on the price level and on interest rates, we can make the economy boom and make America much greater than ever before. much wealthier and much healthier and live much longer, you know, we can ensure that the first American century is not the last. We don't have to be a declining superpower. We can invest our way out of this and achieve prosperity unlike anyone has. No, you know, people have never dreamed of the sort of prosperity and the kind of incredible world we would be living in, where people would live long lives, you know, potentially hundreds of years, like in the health of a 21-year-old, or whatever level they choose. You know, it's escape velocity in terms of if every 5 years, you know, the technology, and say over a 10-year period, if the technology improves so much that your health is actually improving rather than getting worse because of the improvement in technology, you reach sort of an escape velocity where you start becoming younger instead of getting older. And this is what the futurist and you know, the Silicon Valley is all about these days. These people want to live forever, and they really believe that they have a shot at it. Ray Kurzweil, one of the most, he's been described as the one of the greatest thinkers of our age. He really believes that by people who live to be until the year 2040 will, because of the technological exponential advancements in technology which we're experiencing now, if you can make it to 2040, you probably are going to, you know, live for hundreds of years.
You know, people might think that's a bombastic thought, but in the 1800s, going to the moon was a bombastic thought. And if you look at what you're saying through the lens of trend, let's just say that technology, if you looked at technology as a lever, which means you can do more with less. And so every year you do more with less and more, even more with less, and even more with less. The end point of that trajectory is to be able to do everything with nothing. I mean, when you think about it, more with less, more with less, more with less, and the end point is we can do everything with practically nothing. That is an interesting world to explore. The final thought I'll make is my job is as a teacher is to help people take these types of things and position themselves advantageously regardless of where it goes. Bubble expansion, depression, what have you. And along with the idea of the government investing and taking ownership, I certainly wish people would look at equity and seek equity and ownership rather than equity and income. In other words, when they talk about sharing the wealth isn't about redistribution through a paycheck, because that's just going to wind up in my pocket anyway. So it would be beautiful if people, from an education standpoint, if we had a better education czar and said, listen, the new paradigm for an American citizen should be a balance of labor but also of ownership, where we should care much about what we buy as what we make. And, you know, Warren Buffett's a wonderful example of someone who doesn't live on Wall Street, who has simply invested in American business and allowed his share of that business to compound. And I would just submit that if a young person, 13, 14, around the age my children started, I've watched them grow to now, 18, 19-year-old, getting into adulthood, and they already have a greater amount of ownership that they've earned and learned to allocate through financial discipline, where they're not totally in a culture of consumption, but they are in a culture of ownership. And just imagine how it would change America if people learned how to buy assets and learned how to buy them wisely in 1-2 steps. Number one, subscribe to MacroWatch and put in the term April. I can't imagine anyone listening to this conversation that would not want to know what your reading on the pulse of things would be a couple of times a month. And with that knowledge, then you've got to learn how to position yourself for prosperity, protection, and cash flow, so you can position yourself advantageously regardless of where things go. So I think we got a pretty good 1-2 punch, you and I thank you for being on the program. We always budget a little time, and we know better because we can talk forever on this. I love geeking out with you, Richard. I learn so much, and you always have something to make me ponder and kind of stroke the beard that I don't have, and think. So go to Richard's website.
I really admire what you do in terms of teaching people how to really make money in step by step, practically and safely, responsibly, without
Nuts.
reckless, crazy, get rich fast schemes. What you really educate people, just as you were saying, on financial education, how to become an owner of wealth and over time wealthy. I think that's a great service that you do, Andy.
Thank you. We don't need get rich quick when we have compounding on our side. I mean, the tools, if you looked at two great wealth building tools, you have a 1-2 punch. You have compounding, which is a tremendous force, and you have leverage and debt, which is another accelerating force. And when you use those, looking through the lens of utility, you can do very well. My guest has been Richard Duncan. Give your website one more time.
You can find me at richardduncaneconomics.com. That's richardduncaneconomics.com. And my business is MacroWatch, the video newsletter. So check that out. Hit the subscribe button and use the discount coupon code April for a 50% discount.
Oh, I encourage people to follow through on that, and then follow it up with a visit to yourinvestingclass.com. I got 6 numbers on there that'll change your life if you learn how to study them and set goals on them. And I don't say that lightly. I'm convinced that someone that goes to yourinvestingclass.com gets that free resource will walk away saying this actually would be life-changing if I pursued it. So wonderful, again, for you to stay up late in Thailand. I hope you've recovered. I know you have a couple of properties there, and one was affected by the flood, so I hope we're recovering well and that you and your family are doing well, Richard. Thanks for being with us. You've been watching and listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. Quite an episode today. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We'll see you next time.